But the truly unsettling behavior began about 2 months after her death. Nero started seeing her face everywhere in the eyes of a young slave girl, pouring wine in the profile of a senator's wife glimpsed at the games, in the fleeting features of prostitutes wandering Rome's shadowy districts. He would freeze mid-sentence, mid-thought, transfixed by a woman who bore even the faintest resemblance to Poppaea. More than once he startled strangers by grabbing their faces and turning them toward the light, searching for something that simply wasn't there. The palace staff held their breath, hoping the madness would pass. Instead, it deepened. Nero ordered hundreds of portraits and statues of Poppaea, commanding his artists not just to replicate her image, but to recreate her soul. But how could paint or stone conjure the essence of a woman? When the works inevitably failed, Nero would erupt in fury, sometimes having the artists flogged, other times collapsing into sobs. And then, everything changed one day in late 65 AD. Nero, trying to distract himself with state matters, forced himself to personally review administrative appointments, tedious work he normally avoided. A young freedman was brought forward, newly promoted to a clerical post. As Nero glanced up from the scrolls, time seemed to stop. The boy before him couldn't have been older than 15, but there in his face were Poppaea's eyes. Not a resemblance, her actual eyes, wide and soft with thick dark lashes, exactly as Nero remembered them. The boy had her fragile bone structure, the same anxious tilt of the head, even that rare flicker of amber in the irises that caught the oil lamp's glow. Nero shot up from his throne so fast that scrolls flew to the floor. The entire court fell silent as he approached the boy, circling slowly, staring as though a ghost had materialized before him. But his face wasn't twisted in rage. It was lit by something far more disturbing, wild, uncontainable hope. A trembling voice broke the silence. "What is your name?" Nero asked. "Sporus, Divine Augustus. I am Sporus." And here's where we pause, because what most Roman histories gloss over is that Sporus wasn't some street urchin. He was palace-born, the son of a Germanic captive who died giving birth. Raised in the depths of the imperial household, educated with other elite servants in languages, arithmetic and courtly manners superior, Sporus had shown an early promise and was destined for a quiet life of bureaucratic service. But none of that mattered now. In that moment, his identity evaporated. He became the raw material for an emperor's fantasy. Nero studied the boy for what witnesses described as an eternity, though it was likely only minutes, touching his face, adjusting his angle to the light running fingers through his hair like a sculptor inspecting marble. Sporus didn't move, fully aware his life now hung in the balance, yet still unaware of the nightmare he was about to enter. And then Nero stepped back. A slow euphoric smile spread across his face. One court chronicler would later write that it looked like the expression of a man who believed he had just conquered death itself. "Cancel the rest of today's appointments," Nero commanded, "and summon my personal physicians. Tell them to prepare their finest chambers and their sharpest instruments. We have work to do." But the transformation of Sporus didn't start with surgery. That would come later. First, Nero had to study him to analyze every feature, every movement, every sound, so he could mold the boy into the image of his lost empress. For days, Sporus lived in opulent quarters just steps from Nero's own, subjected to a relentless routine of examinations. Imperial artists who had once painted Poppaea from life were summoned and ordered to sketch Sporus in detail, identifying where his features aligned with hers and where they fell short. Nero obsessed over the drawings, poring over them like sacred manuscripts, scrawling notes in the margins outlining changes. But this wasn't just about appearance. Nero made Sporus speak for hours, adjusting his pitch, refining the way he formed his vowels, training him to speak with Poppaea's signature cadence. He was tested on how he walked, how he gestured, how he held his hands at rest. Every trait that didn't match was flagged for correction. The psychological assault had already begun. Sporus was no longer permitted to use his own name. Everyone around him, servants, guards, tutors, was instructed to call him lady or mistress. His plain tunics were stripped away and replaced with flowing stolas dyed in Poppaea's favourite hues. He was taught the art of applying cosmetics, not the simple enhancements of a Roman youth, but the intricate stylized beauty of a noblewoman. Imagine waking up each morning and seeing your own identity dissolve piece by piece in the reflection of a polished bronze mirror. The palace staff later whispered that during these days, Sporus barely spoke, barely ate, drifting through the corridors like a ghost. But he didn't resist. He couldn't. Resistance meant death or worse. By now, Sporus understood what was coming. Nero had made no effort to hide it. He talked about his plan constantly with the pride of a sculptor describing a masterpiece in progress. The emperor's physicians had already been briefed. The procedure was clear. Sporus was to be physically remade into a woman not merely castrated, which was already a known practice in Roman society, but surgically altered in a way that had never been attempted. This wasn't the creation of a eunuch. It was a crude experimental attempt to reconstruct the body itself to turn a teenage boy into a living replica of a dead empress. The doctors, caught between fear of execution and promises of unimaginable rewards, designed a series of operations that pushed the boundaries of ancient medicine. And then the night before the first surgery, something unexpected happened. Nero came to Sporus's chamber carrying a small wooden box. Inside was Poppaea's wedding ring, a massive emerald surrounded by pearls. Tomorrow, Nero whispered, sliding the ring onto Sporus's finger, where it hung loose and cold. You will be reborn. You will become who you were always meant to be, and I will love you as I loved her. Sporus finally found his voice barely louder than breath. Will it hurt? For a fleeting second, something human flickered in Nero's eyes, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by that familiar feverish certainty. Birth always hurts, he replied, but what emerges is beautiful. The surgery took place in a specially prepared chamber deep within the palace's medical wing. Historical records are mercifully vague on the specifics, but what little survives tells us the procedure lasted for hours. Sporus's screams, according to one account, echoed through 3 corridors despite the stone walls. Nero waited just outside, pacing like a father awaiting his heir, occasionally shouting words of encouragement, as if his voice could soften the pain inside. Recovery took months. In a world without antibiotics, infection was a constant danger. The modifications were so invasive that Sporus had to relearn how to walk, how to sit, even how to breathe without pain. Through it all, Nero hovered, constantly adjusting doses of poppy extract, overseeing bandage changes, even tending to wounds with his own imperial hands. It might sound like devotion, but it wasn't care, it was creation. Nero wasn't healing a person, he was shaping a possession, sculpting flesh to match a memory. Every gesture of affection came tethered to a reminder of who Sporus was expected to become. Nero would sit by his bedside and read from Poppaea's favourite poets, tell long stories from their life together, as if Sporus should recall those moments too. The line between reality and delusion blurred until it nearly disappeared. Once Sporus could stand without assistance, the psychological transformation began in earnest. Tutors descended upon him like a regiment, drilling every aspect of imperial womanhood. He learned to walk with the soft sway of a Roman matron, to sit with his ankles crossed just so to hold a wine cup in exactly the manner expected of a woman born to power. His hands were trained to move with fluid, intentional grace. His voice training was relentless. For hours each day, he was forced to practice speaking in softer, higher tones, shaping his sentences with the musical rise and fall that had once charmed Roman senators. He learned to mimic Poppaea's way of laughing, her phrasing, even her particular way of addressing friends versus rivals. A new wardrobe was crafted, not just fashionable dresses, but replicas of Poppaea's signature outfits. Imperial seamstresses, working from preserved patterns and sketches, recreated her most iconic gowns. Jewelers resized her treasured pieces to fit Sporus's slightly leaner frame. Her personal perfume was recreated by mixing rare oils and resins from the East, matched note for note, but it wasn't enough to look like Poppaea. Sporus had to live as her. He was trained in the daily rituals of noble women, morning beauty routines that took hours, elaborate hairstyles that required multiple attendants, the subtle art of reclining at banquets, the exact balance of being charming, without overstepping the bounds of expected female modesty. And then it got darker. Nero didn't just want Sporus to resemble Poppaea, he wanted him to be Poppaea. Sporus was forced to study her life in detail, her childhood in Pompeii, her first marriage, her political ascent. He memorized her favourite foods, the names of her close friends, her opinions on literature and imperial policy. When Nero recalled shared moments, Sporus had to respond as if he'd lived them too. About 6 months after the surgery, the first public test, came a small private dinner with Nero's closest advisors and their wives. Rumours had been swirling through the court for months, but when Sporus entered the room draped in Poppeia's signature purple gown with her jewellery sparkling under lamplight, the reaction was instant and electric. Conversation halted. Wine cups froze mid-air. What stood before them wasn't just a look-alike, it was her. In the softened glow with makeup perfectly applied and every movement carefully trained, Sporus was Poppaea. The tilt of the head, the shy half-smile, the graceful sweep of a hand. It was uncanny, it was chilling. It was exactly what Nero had wanted. Or rather, it was a performance of Poppaea so flawless that for brief moments even the most jaded courtiers found themselves slipping into the illusion. Nero basked in the attention like a triumphant artist unveiling his greatest creation. He kept one possessive hand on Sporus throughout the evening, introducing him as my beloved Sabina, using Poppaea's family name with casual certainty. The guest seasoned survivors of Roman politics played along with theatrical enthusiasm, their laughter just a little too loud, their compliments a little too rehearsed. They flattered Sabina's beauty, inquired about her health, spoke with her as if the months of mourning had never happened, as if Poppaea had never died at all. But illusion has limits. Tacitus, writing with the bitter clarity of hindsight, recorded the private observations of those trapped inside the charade. They noticed Sporus's hands, despite endless treatments, were still a touch too large. His shoulders, concealed beneath fine fabric, held the unmistakable breadth of a man. Sometimes in unguarded moments his natural voice would slip through the carefully trained feminine tones, but what truly broke hearts were the rare flashes of the boy beneath the mask. Observers described fleeting glimpses of a sharp, dry wit, a quiet intelligence, and a sorrow that had nothing to do with Poppaea traits that were undeniably Sporus, not Sabina. But any hint of individuality was swiftly crushed. Punishment didn't come in bruises. Nero wouldn't risk damaging his perfect illusion, but in cold detachment. He would withdraw affection, fall silent for hours or days, whisper threats of finding someone more worthy of Poppaea's legacy if Sporus failed to maintain the fantasy. Then came the wedding announcement, and with it the breaking point for many who thought they had already seen the worst. It was early 67 AD. Nero, Emperor of Rome, publicly declared his intention to marry Sporus in a full state ceremony, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Rome blinked, and then obeyed. Plans for the wedding were drawn from ancient tradition. Priests prepared sacrifices, processional routes were festooned with flowers, invitations were sent to every senator, magistrate, and foreign envoy in the empire. Attendance was mandatory, no one dared decline. The ceremony was surreal. Sporus veiled in the traditional saffron-coloured bridal garb, his face painted. In ceremonial cosmetics, stood beside Nero like any Roman bride. A dowry was presented, an absurdly large fortune in gold and property transferred with the proper legal formulas. Marriage contracts were signed as if this were a legitimate union capable of producing heirs. Nero, ever the performer, embraced his role with chilling sincerity. He recited ancient vows, offered the ritual sacrifices, and even carried Sporus over the threshold in front of witnesses, just as custom demanded. The wedding feast defied imagination. Dishes of roasted peacock stuffed with songbirds, rivers of wine from Caesar's private cellars, music and dance from the empire's most gifted artists. The elite of Rome smiled through it all, their faces masks of forced joy. They brought gifts for the new empress jewellery, exotic perfumes, intricately carved household items. Some even offered fertility charms, whether as dark humour or desperate flattery no one could say. Senators stood to give speeches praising the beauty of the bride, the strength of the marriage, and the divine blessing it must surely represent. And through it all Sporus smiled, because he had no choice. Poets composed elaborate epithalamiums, wedding poems, celebrating the union, spinning verses about eternal love and divine favour. But behind the polished facade, Everyone knew the truth. They were witnessing something grotesque, something fundamentally wrong. This wasn't just another one of Nero's infamous excesses. It was a violation of Roman tradition, natural law, and human dignity, and yet they applauded, smiled, raised their cups to toast the happy couple, because the alternative was unthinkable: death. If you're finding this story as disturbing as I am, leave a comment below. I want to know. Had you ever heard of this twisted chapter of Roman history before? And don't forget to subscribe if you want more hidden truths your teachers definitely didn't cover in school. Life as Nero's empress wasn't a role. It was a full-time performance that never ended. Each morning Sporus woke in Poppæa's chambers surrounded by her belongings, her perfumes, her dresses, her ghost. The very same servants who had once attended the real empress now dressed him in her clothes, styled his hair in her favourite fashions, and applied the cosmetics needed to maintain the illusion. Every movement, every word, every breath had to be measured, calibrated to continue the lie. The public appearances were perhaps the most unbearable. Nero insisted on parading his new wife everywhere to the theatre, the circus, religious festivals, official state events. Sporus sat beside the emperor in the Imperial box at the Colosseum, was carried in Poppæa's ceremonial litter, through the streets, received the honours reserved only for an Augusta. The Roman crowds, ever hungry for spectacle, came out in droves to see this impossible creation, a boy made into a ghost. During Nero's grand tour of Greece in 67 AD, the act reached its most absurd extremes. The Greeks, desperate to appease their Roman overlords, treated Sporus with the full reverence due to an empress. He presided over banquets, attended Nero's musical recitals, even participated in sacred rituals reserved exclusively for the emperor's wife. In Olympia, priests offered prayers that the imperial couple might be blessed with children, playing along with the fiction no matter how biologically impossible it was. But it was in the private moments behind the palace doors where the horror of Sporus's existence became undeniable. Nero didn't just expect affection, he demanded that Sporus respond not merely as a woman, but as Poppæa specifically. He had to mimic her voice, her laugh, her preferences. He was expected to know intimate details, recreate shared jokes, respond to touch exactly as she once had. Any slip, any failure to maintain the fantasy could provoke terrifying rage, or worse, a cold, disappointed silence that left Sporus begging for punishment instead. The rest of the imperial household regarded him with a toxic mix of pity, fear, and revulsion. He was something unnatural, something caught in between neither man nor woman, neither free nor enslaved, neither fully alive nor truly dead. Palace servants whispered about seeing him alone in the gardens at dawn, standing still among the statues as if unsure how to exist without an audience. Of course, there were attempts to escape. How could there not be? But where could someone so recognizable go? His appearance, his feminine bearing, the imperial jewelry he was never allowed to remove. These marked him as clearly as any brand. The one recorded attempt ended in catastrophe. The accomplices who tried to help him flee were captured and crucified in the palace courtyard directly within Sporus's view. A message as clear as it was cruel: even death won't save you from me. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of all wasn't the violence or the control, it was Nero's twisted tenderness. Because in his delusion the emperor truly seemed to believe he had brought his beloved back from the dead. That what he had done wasn't torture but resurrection. And that made it all the more horrifying. Nero would lavish Sporus with gifts, whisper sweet endearments, and shield him from any insult, no matter how small. To outsiders it might have looked like devotion, an emperor tenderly in love with his empress. But how can love exist when one person has been surgically and psychologically refashioned to fit someone else's fantasy? Historians now believe that over time Sporus developed symptoms we'd recognize as severe dissociative disorder. He began referring to himself as Poppæa even when Nero wasn't around. Servants reported finding him holding conversations with mirrors, shifting between his natural voice and the higher trained tone of his forced persona. The line between the boy he once was and the role he was forced to play blurred, perhaps because his mind had no other way to survive the relentless trauma. Then came the spring of 68 AD, when Nero's empire began to fall apart. Uprisings flared across the provinces. The Senate turned on him. The Praetorian Guard, once his fiercest protectors, abandoned him. Nero fled Rome with only a small band of loyalists, and among them as always was Sporus. Even in exile, Nero couldn't part with his constructed Poppaea. The final days in a crumbling villa outside Rome were a spiral into madness. Nero flipped between delusional escape fantasies and elaborate suicide rehearsals. Through it all, Sporus stayed close still in character, still playing the dutiful wife as the world collapsed. Witnesses recalled the emperor clutching Sporus, calling him my only love, my resurrection, begging him to die with him in some tragic, theatrical ending. And when word came that Nero's captors were closing in, he made his final choice: death. But even then the play wasn't over. He asked Sporus to begin the formal mourning rites, to weep and wail, like Poppaea would have to make his death dramatic, poetic. As Nero pressed the blade to his throat, trembling and uncertain, it was Sporus who steadied his hand and helped guide the dagger. Perhaps it was the only moment of mercy between them. Nero died, but Sporus's nightmare didn't. He became a living relic of Rome's darkest indulgence, a symbol of Nero's madness, something powerful men wanted to control, display, or exploit. The generals fighting for control of the empire saw Sporus not as a person, but as a prize, a curiosity, a potential political asset. First came Galba, the aged general who briefly seized the throne. He treated Sporus with cold formality, keeping him in the palace, but offering little attention. For a short time, Sporus lived in a strange limbo, still dressed as a woman, still called Sabina, but no longer the centre of imperial obsession. Galba's reign lasted only 7 months before he was murdered in the Forum. Then came Otho, a man with a uniquely disturbing connection to Sporus. He had been Poppaea's husband before Nero took her. It's unclear what Otho saw in the boy who now wore her face revenge longing or delusion, but records suggest he treated Sporus as a legitimate imperial widow and even considered marrying him himself. That plan never came to fruition. Otho's reign ended abruptly when he lost the Battle of Bedriacum and took his own life. After his death, Sporus passed once again to the victor Vitellius, and it was under Vitellius that Sporus' story reached its final brutal chapter. Vitellius was a different kind of emperor, boorish gluttonous, with no taste for the twisted pageantry of Nero. He saw no value in Sporus as a person, a symbol, or even a possession. To him, Sporus was nothing more than a novelty, a grotesque amusement for the bloodthirsty crowd. And here the story takes its darkest turn. Vitellius announced a public spectacle in the Colosseum. Sporus would not be seated in the imperial box, but thrust into the arena as part of the games. The plan was gruesomely theatrical, a reenactment of the myth of Proserpina, the maiden dragged into the underworld by Pluto. In this staged nightmare, Sporus would be abducted by gladiators dressed as demons, publicly violated, and then executed, all for entertainment. When Sporus learned of the fate awaiting him, he finally found the courage that had eluded him through years of forced submission. Rather than endure one final, soul-crushing performance, he chose death on his own terms. The method varies in historical accounts. Some say he drank poison, others that he opened his veins in the traditional Roman fashion, but all agree on one fact: he took his own life. He was around 20 years old. The tragedy of Sporus forces us to confront painful truths about identity, autonomy, and the horrifying consequences of unchecked power. Here was a person dismantled and rebuilt to fulfill another man's fantasy. Every layer of his being, his body, his thoughts, his name was violated and reshaped. He became a ghost in his own life, compelled to love the very man who had destroyed him. What makes his story so haunting is how thoroughly the real Sporus has been erased. We don't know what he wanted. We don't know what he believed. We don't even know his true name. Sporus may have been a cruel nickname meaning seed or sown thing, emphasizing the grotesque transformation he was forced to undergo. The boy who walked into Nero's presence that day effectively vanished, replaced by an illusion that lasted until death released him. Modern historians still debate whether Sporus ever managed to assert any agency during his captivity. Some argue that his final act, choosing suicide, was his one undeniable moment of self-determination. Others point to smaller moments: the escape attempt, the decision to help Nero die, rather than prolong the charade, the brief flashes of his real voice breaking through the mask. But perhaps the most unsettling part of Sporus' story is how many people were complicit. The physicians who performed the surgery, the tutors who trained him, the courtiers who played along, the servants who helped him dress each day. Hundreds of individuals chose science and self-preservation over compassion for a teenager being consumed by a madman's obsession. The story of Sporus is a grim reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked, when fantasy overrides reality, when a society chooses compliance over conscience. It shows how quickly people can become raw material in someone else's dream and how easily cruelty can be masked as ritual madness, as tradition, horror, as spectacle. If this story has disturbed you as deeply as it has me, leave a comment below. I want to know what you're thinking. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden corners of history, the ones your textbooks left out, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. In the grand sweep of Roman history, Sporus is often mentioned only in passing, just another symptom of Nero's decadence. But he was more than a footnote. He was a human being abducted, mutilated, erased, forced to live as someone else in someone else's tragedy. And in the end, he made the only choice he had left. Somewhere beneath the ruins of Nero's palace, buried under centuries of stone and silence, are the chambers where Sporus was held, where he practiced the voice that wasn't his, where he stood before polished bronze mirrors that showed him a stranger's face. The walls remember, even if history almost forgot the boy who was made into a ghost. Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.